What's going on, everybody? I'm Matt Dimech.
And I'm Madison Elliott.
And we're bringing you our Week 11 Fantasy Football Stardom Picks. For my first stardom pick, I'm going to be taking Calvin Ridley. It was a bit of a slow adjustment for Calvin Ridley when he first got to the Tennessee Titans this season, but he's really started to pick up his stride. In each of the last 5 games, he's gotten 8 or more targets, and in his last 3 games, he's had double-digit point performances, with 2 of those being 20-point games. Last week, he had his best performance of the season, hauling in 5 catches for 84 yards, amassing 25.4 fantasy points, his best performance of the season to this point. This week, they have a much more favorable matchup against the Minnesota Vikings, who are ranked 7th in the NFL in passing yards allowed per game at 231.9. I think with Ridley starting to pick things up, paired with this favorable matchup, I think Ridley's going to make a great wide receiver 2 options for fantasy managers this week.
For my first start of Week 11, I have the Steelers wide receiver George Pickens versus the Ravens. George Pickens is an elite option with Russell Wilson back starting for the Steelers. The first 6 weeks might have looked a little bleak for Pickens in terms of production, but things have really turned around since Russ took over. Wilson has made 3 starts for the Steelers so far, and Pickens has maintained 45.5% end zone target share with 2.22 yards per route run in that sample. He has 545 receiving yards on passes outside the numbers this season, which is the most in the NFL, and has been wide receiver 5 or better in the league in the last 2 out of 3 games with Wilson as his quarterback. The matchup couldn't be better this week. The Steelers facing a Ravens defense that has permitted the most fantasy points per game, most receiving touchdowns, and 7th most yards per run to wide receivers.
For my second stardom pick, I'm going to be taking Audric Estime. Estime missed 5 of the first 6 games of the season due to injury, and since coming back really hasn't done too much. So why am I starting him? Last week, he had his career-high 14 touches against the Kansas City Chiefs, and he made a gain of 53 yards, which is the career high for the rookie. What's interesting about this game is that the veteran Javonte Williams only took 1 touch in this game. Sean Payton said after the game that he was very encouraged by Audric's performance and that we can expect him to get a lot more production in the coming weeks. He's projected for 8 points this week after only being projected for 2.5 in the week prior. Audric would be a great waiver wire pickup for any owners who are in a tight bind with their running back situation.
For my next pick of Week 11, I have Cincinnati running back Chase Brown versus the Chargers. We have seen 2 games so far of Brown being the full-time starting back for the Bengals, and so far he looks pretty promising. In the last 2 games, he has an 83% snap rate, 68% route rate, 17% target share, and 88.9% red zone rushing share. Additionally, he has amassed 125 scrimmage yards on 27 touches per game within those 2 games. The numbers here speak for themselves, but furthermore, he was able to do this against a Ravens defense that has given up the 7th fewest fantasy points to running backs with a strong run defense. I would definitely start him this week at running back.
For my first sit-in pick, I'm going to be taking Jacksonville Jaguars running back Travis Etienne. Etienne was underwhelming to start the season, but I don't think anyone anticipated the fall-off that we've seen in recent weeks. He only had 5 points in each of the last 2 weeks after missing the prior 2 weeks with injury. He's amassed less than 100 yards in his last 4 starts. To add to these struggles, the Jags are facing the Lions this week, who have been one of the top run defenses in the league, only allowing on average around 100 rush yards per game. If you're in a desperate spot and you need a flex, sure, keep him in. But if you have any other serviceable options, I'd recommend pushing Travis Etienne to the bench this week.
For my sit-em, I have another Jaguars player, wide receiver Brian Thomas Jr. versus Detroit. Thomas has scored 6.2 PPR points or less in his past 2 games. He struggles with Trevor Lawrence out, and Trevor Lawrence remains out this week versus the Lions. Against the Vikings with Mac Jones starting, Thomas only had 2 catches for 12 yards and 3 targets. The Lions have been successful on almost all fronts, and the Jags are going to have to start Mac Jones under center again. Until Lawrence returns or the Jags figure it out, I would for sure keep the rookie wide receiver on your bench.
For my final sit-in pick, I'm going to be sitting Dallas Cowboys tight end Jake Ferguson. Jake Ferguson has been solid tight end for fantasy owners this season, but nonetheless has been extremely disappointed. He was expected to be one of the tier 2 tight ends going in the 5th or 6th or 7th round, and last week he posted just 4 fantasy points on 4 catches for 24 yards, and this actually led the team in receiving yards in their loss against the Philadelphia Eagles. The injury of Dak Prescott has put Cooper Rush under center for the Cowboys, and we saw the offense struggle with him. So I think that this uncertainty at quarterback it's going to make starting Ferguson less than ideal. If you have any other options, I'd suggest pushing him to the bench.
For my last sit of Week 11, I have the Vikings quarterback Sam Darnold versus the Titans. Darnold had his worst game since his 5.3 London dud last week, obtaining just 9.4 fantasy points and a 12-7 win over the Jacksonville Jaguars. Honestly, this was a soft matchup for the Vikings, yet Darnold completed only 63% of his passes for 241 yards. More concerningly, he had a 0-3 touchdown to interception ratio. He has now thrown as many interceptions in the last 2 games as he did in the first 7. We have seen Darnold go back to old habits in the last 2 games, and his upcoming schedule may keep the streak alive. He may have put up some impressive passing numbers in the beginning of the season, but his recent performance and upcoming schedule certainly don't do him any favors.
That's going to do it for our Week 11 fantasy football stardom sit-em picks. Good luck out there, fantasy owners.